policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. A little bit later, we will spend some time talking about the State of the Union address. I don't know how many of you had a chance to watch it or hear it. We did, so we did it for you, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later in the program. But we pushed that to the second hour because we have in studio with us today Valerie Huber. She is the president and CEO of the National Abstinence Education Association. Because she's in studio and in town, we certainly wanted to have a chance to talk with her. And Valerie, we certainly welcome you back to the microphone.
Well, thanks, Kerby. It's always great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're actually in the new studio. You were with us in the old studio, and so
yes.
You've seen we've upgraded a little bit.
This is great.
It certainly is the case. I might mention for our listeners in Ohio that in the past, she actually served as the Title V Abstinence Education Coordinator for the state of Ohio, where she provided oversight and grant awards to community abstinence programs, and of course is now heading up this National Abstinence Education Association. And in just a few minutes, we're going to talk about some legislation being introduced in Congress. Lots of things happening in Congress, but let's, if we can, just talk about your desire to really educate people about abstinence. If there is any social movement right now that has more misinformation and misconceptions, it is certainly that. So you have your work cut out for you, don't you?
Well, we do. You know, just the term abstinence or abstinence education elicits an immediate response.
Yeah.
Some positive, unfortunately much negative. And the reason it's negative has very little to do with what our programs are actually teaching, but the baggage that's attached to the term, simply because our opponents have done a great job of mischaracterizing us.
Well, and a lot of what we spend time talking about on this program is just risk behavior, whether it is to have Dan Bailey on, who's with Just Say Yes, or whether it's Marilyn Morris, I'm the chairman of her board on Aim for Success, or many other individuals, or Pure Hope and Noel Boucher. We just recognize that young people today are involved in all sorts of risk behaviors, whether it's drugs and alcohol, whether it's sex, whether it's bullying, whatever it might be. And it does seem to me that if you are really involved in risk avoidance, you really should be for abstinence. But as you said, it has been vilified in a number of ways, hasn't it?
Right. And I love the term risk avoidance. I mean, it hails right from the public health model for addressing healthy behaviors and averting risk behaviors. And if we're talking about avoiding drugs or underage drinking or any number of kind of behaviors, there's always that strong cultural message that encourages best health outcomes by risk avoidance. That model, though, falls down when we're talking about teen sex. We argue that it shouldn't. And not only that, you just touched on the point that when we're talking about whether or not a teen has sex, it's really a conversation that goes much further than that. We're really hitting on most of the societal ills that all of us care about, and that were touched on even in last night's State of the Union address.
A very good example of that. You know, when you talk about this idea of risk avoidance, it's funny how we do kind of put sex in a different category, because if you had somebody come in and say, well, you know, you shouldn't use drugs, but if you are going to use drugs, here's a safe way to use drugs. I mean, those people would be thrown out on their ear. If somebody said, well, you know, we don't think you should be engaged in bullying other kids, but if you do bully, here's at least a way that maybe creates less trauma for the people that you're bullying. Again, we wouldn't even allow them in the door. But somehow we have this sort of mindset when it comes to sex. Well, we don't think you should have sex before marriage, but if you're going to have sex before marriage, let's teach you how to do it in a safe way. Am I missing something here?
Well, and some even go further. I was just reading, there's new curriculum now out, and this is specifically designed for teens, that yes means yes. Yeah. And so, you know, it translates the debate on the college campuses, but they had a little sideline that says, teach young people that saying yes enthusiastically can lead to healthy sexual activity.
Oh, boy.
You have to scratch your head and say, where is health involved in that?
We just yesterday had Mike Huckabee on, and one of the things he's being pilloried for right now is suggesting that maybe it's not such a good idea to watch Beyonce and to listen to Beyonce lyrics.
I heard about that.
Yeah, and so I gave him a chance yesterday to kind of speak to that issue a little bit, and his point's well taken. In his own testimony, the president and the first lady say, especially the president says, I feel a little uncomfortable listening to some of the music sung by Beyonce in the presence of my daughters. And you're thinking, well, if you feel uncomfortable with your daughters, why do you have your daughters listen to it? Because on the one hand, the First Lady, I think, is really saying she really wants to make sure that in her household and in households of America, children eat right. What they put into their mouths, what they put into their stomachs are good and wholesome. But what about what they put in their ears? And of course, you're fighting this uphill battle on abstinence because sadly, a lot of the pop music right now, Miley Cyrus or Beyonce, I can go down a long list, Lady Gaga and others, encourage sexual activity and thus expose young people to sexually transmitted diseases and all sorts of regrets. True?
Right. Normalizes teen sexual activity and makes it an expected part, kind of a transition to adulthood. Whereas if you look at the trends for young people, she paints a very different picture. They're starting to get it.
Yeah.
Some of the adults and the adult mentors in their lives need to catch up.
And the Centers for Disease Control, as I've looked at it, seem to indicate that even though we don't fund abstinence education like we used to, still the number of young people getting involved in first sexual activity is declining. Is that true?
16% decrease over the last 20 years. Now, if you put that figure and superimpose it on the growing sexualization of our culture, it hardly makes sense. Something is going on, and it shows that this is a message that's resonating with young people in spite of the fact that most adults don't think they will or can make that decision. Just imagine what those numbers would look like if adults like you and me and people like Beyonce and teachers and policymakers would say, we think that young people deserve something better, and indeed they're making choices that are more healthy than we imagine.
Well, and that's certainly what we do in the athletic field. We really set the bar really high. And I've seen young people work really hard to achieve a level of success in organized sports, in individual sports, or in music, or in academics. And again, the one place where we say, yeah, well, we just don't think you can meet the standard. I don't think we can afford to set the bar too high is in this issue of human sexuality, I should say. Yeah.
If you look at the social science research regarding high expectations,
yes,
it's very instructive. And here's what it says. If you set the bar low, few will reach that bar. None will go over.
Yes.
If you set the bar of expectations high, while not all youth will achieve that bar, they will achieve higher than they would have without that. And it's very instructive when we're talking about optimal health outcomes and then providing skills so that they can actually achieve it.
Talking today about the National Abstinence Education Association. Valerie Huber with us, and a little bit later we're going to open up the phones. I'd love to get some of your comments about this. But when we come back, we're going to get political, as we do so often here. Talk about legislation that is very important for you to know about, and it certainly relates to this idea of sexual risk avoidance education, or what many people in the past called abstinence education. So we'll continue our conversation, open up the phones in just a few minutes. All that coming up right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
When the Affordable Care Act was debated years ago, one of the most compelling arguments for its passage was a claim that it would make health insurance affordable for people with lower incomes. Now that the employer mandate kicks in 2015, we're finding that it is the people with modest incomes who are being hurt the most. Dr. John Goodman has for decades provided expert testimony before Congress on healthcare issues and health insurance. His survey last month of 136 fast food restaurants with nearly 3,500 workers tells the story. The regulations in Obamacare forced the employers to make tough financial decisions that had an adverse impact on their employees and families. Let's take a before and after picture. Before 2014, about half of these 3,500 workers were full-time, according to the Obamacare definition. In other words, they worked 30 or more hours a week. By the end of 2014, only 58 employees were full-time and thus eligible for health insurance by 2015. The companies then offered the remaining full-time employees health insurance. What they offered was a bronze plan with very large deductibles, over $6,000, and copays. Hardly anyone wanted a high deductible plan. Actually, that's an understatement. Only one of the 58 remaining full-time employees enrolled in a bronze plan. The rest may end up with a minimum essential coverage plan. You know, this survey bothers me for two reasons. First, John Goodman and many others predicted that this would happen years ago. Congress did not listen. Second, it is appalling that it had to be done by a private citizen. Where are the news bureaus and government agencies? Why haven't they done a similar study on the impact of Obamacare? We've not been well served either by politicians, bureaucrats, or the media. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Valerie Huber with us today. She is the president of the National Abstinence Education Association. And I thought for just a minute we might talk about certainly how this all fits together, because some people, as I've said before, tend to see sex isolated. But if you want to talk about a holistic effort to really begin to help young people avoid problems later on that will devastate them, that will cause their dreams to be shattered, this all fits into a kind of a bigger package, doesn't it?
It really does. I love traveling around the country and talking to young people who are a part of some of the organizations who are members of NAEA. Not long ago, I was in an inner city, and this was an area of high poverty, high dropout rates, high teen pregnancy, high birth rates, the whole bit. A lot of fatherlessness in homes. And I talked to the provider there who was reaching many young people who were going on to college and weren't getting pregnant and weren't getting involved in drugs, all of these positive things. And I talked to her and I said, what was it that compelled you to work with young people that a lot of others say they don't have a chance? Mm-hmm. And she said, I'm giving them a vision for their future, right, to escape poverty. And when she shared it, and I heard her talking to young people, it was inspiring. And it's not just a stump speech that doesn't have any ground in the research. It's actually a huge study by the Brookings Institute, which aren't typically on the same side as we are on social issues, and yet they say there's something called the success sequence. And if young people implement this in their lives young, they virtually eliminate their risk of growing up in poverty and living in poverty as adults. The first is graduate from high school. Right. Then in sequence, get a job. And finally, wait until you're at least 21 and married before having children. Well, if you look at what our sexual risk avoidance or SRA programs teach, It's those very things, the skills to help them stay focused on their education, not to get sidetracked, but think of the future and set goals for that. Then be productive members of society and get the skills to understand healthy relationships, marry, and then have children. It's a recipe for success, and more young people are buying into that because they see that for them, they don't have to be a continuation of a cycle they see around them. They can break out and have unparalleled success.
You know, one of the things we were talking about even just the other day is the president has talked about wanting more money for anti-poverty programs. And after a while, you've got to say, is this really the best way to spend our money? We've had a 50-year war on poverty since Lyndon Johnson. We spent $22 trillion on that. And I've asked the question, Valerie, before, if I were to give somebody $500 billion every year for 50 years, to deal with poverty, would you come up with the programs that we have here right now? And I've had no one has ever taken me up on it and said, oh yeah, this is exactly how I deal with poverty. On the other hand, you're talking about some of the cultural factors that are very significant, and some have actually said that if you do those three things, you have less than an 8% chance to be in poverty. But if you violate just one of those things, you have a very high percentage, and we'll give some of those in just a minute because I've done a commentary on it. And it illustrates, again, that sometimes we are spending money in the wrong places. We're failing to understand the importance of cultural, psychological, and most importantly, spiritual issues in some of these topics. And so, again, it's just an illustration that if we really want to deal with poverty, some of these risk avoidance education programs are very, very essential, aren't they?
They are. And a story comes to mind. Not long ago, we were pleased to bring a group of African-American leaders to the White House to talk about this very issue. And they shared those very compelling stories of escaping poverty and young people who are just doing amazing things as a result of our programs. And at the conclusion of the meeting, the president's advisor said, this is very compelling. Mm-hmm. It's not at all what I expected SRA, or formerly Abstinence education programs, to be like. And I think it opens up the conversation to those who truly care about the future of this next generation.
You know, you were talking about that woman that was involved in inner city. I know the story about Elaine Bennett. You know, Bill Bennett's been on this program as well, and she did a thing called Best Friends. Mm-hmm. And here again, working in the District of Columbia, having lived in Washington, D.C. for a while, I understand how devastating some of those situations are in terms of poverty, dysfunction, broken families, and all the rest. And yet, her success story was off the charts because once she was able to help them see their vision and understand the dangers of sexually transmitted diseases, the dangers of being involved sexually and having a child out of wedlock, she had a success rate that was the envy of the modern world, wasn't it?
Yes, I had the honor of being able to attend one of her graduation ceremonies for the young girls who were about to graduate high school. And while we were waiting for the ceremony to begin, I stood next to one of the moms of one of these girls, and I said, what is it about this program that is so important to you as a mom? And she said, I didn't care what else my daughter learned when she was in school. I made sure that she never lost the opportunity to be a part of Best Friends. And she started crying, actually, because now her daughter was going on to college. She wasn't involved in drugs. She wasn't involved in any of the risk behaviors that so many of her peers were. And she had a bright future ahead of her. And what more would a mom want?
Wow. You know, we've talked about the fact that we've seen sexual activity decrease, Centers for Disease Control. We've talked about a few of these anecdotal stories. But just before we get into some of this legislation, you have more than 24 peer-reviewed articles that demonstrate that abstinence really does work.
It's a really good point, and I think that's one of the secrets that a lot of people don't realize, mainly because the mainstream media doesn't do a very good job of promoting the success of our programs. Yes, about 24 or 26 different studies that show that students who are a part of our programs are much more likely to wait to have sex, And of course, if an abstinence education program is successful, you'd certainly think that would be a success marker, right?
Yeah.
But our critics have said that, well, that might be fine for students who've never had sex, but the sexually active students, this is totally irrelevant for them. Our research shows the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
It shows that our programs help every student in that classroom, regardless of where their sexual experience is. And in fact, if they are sexually experienced, they're more likely to discontinue that sexual activity, at the very least, reduce the amount of sexual activity they have. And oftentimes they say, this is the first time anyone has ever told me I didn't have to have sex.
Right.
And I was looking for something, and I found that that void was not filled just by having sex. They're open to something else.
I've looked at some of those studies too, and they show that there's a high level of regret, as evidenced by the fact that the individuals that have abstained from sex have a suicide rate much, much lower than those who have gotten involved. The individuals that have abstained from sex have a much lower incidence of depression than those who have been sexually active. So it would make sense that sometimes after they've done that, and there's a sense of regret, a sense of depression, maybe even a sense of futility, to have somebody come in and say, there's still hope for you, and there are still positive things that you can do to have positive outcomes in your life, it would seem that would make sense as well.
Yeah, we always like to encourage young people that past decisions do not need to dictate your future. And by offering hope that unhealthy choices that you made in the past were yesterday, we believe in you, and here are some ways that you can make different decisions in the future, and not just telling them that you must do this, or, you really messed up here, but inspiring them to something more. And they are very open to that, and actually very encouraged that another adult believes in them enough to want something better.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll take some phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. We're going to give you some action items because there are a couple of pieces of legislation you need to know about. And just think about this in light of our conversation tomorrow when we talk about the anniversary of Roe versus Wade. Many of you said, well, we need to address the issue of abortion upstream. Well, this is what we're doing, addressing it upstream. If young people are not sexually active, if they're not engaged in risky sexual behavior, it is quite likely, probably a certainty, that they will not be pregnant and they will not need an abortion. And so, indeed, this is something that should be something that all people would celebrate and support. As we well know, that isn't the case. So we're going to talk about some legislation, and also would love to get your comments. What about abstinence education, risk avoidance education? Love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. We'll continue our conversation with Valerie Huber right after this.
Did you catch Eric Holder on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos? He said the president is planning a summit to study those who, quote, corrupt the Islamic faith to justify terrorism. But since it was Muhammad himself leading the slaughter of men, women, and children for not bowing to Allah back in the 7th century, I wonder if they might discover who corrupted it back then. It takes real effort to ignore the obvious, but it would seem our officials and many in the media make that effort. They can't see that those who take part in terrorist acts are following a straightforward interpretation of Muhammad's teachings and actions and all of the Quran. In a world of political correctness, Point of View Radio stands out. We seek the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and bring it to you daily. But we cannot be here without your support. Give online at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get to some of those phone calls in just a minute, talking about abstinence and sexual risk avoidance education. But before we take some phone calls, I want to talk about an action item. We have a lot of activists out there, and there is now being introduced into Congress what is called the Healthy Relationships Act. And I've heard a little bit about this because I noticed that in the House you have kind of a bipartisan approach. You have one representative who is a Republican from Illinois, one representative who is a Democrat from Illinois who have sponsored it. In the Senate, you have Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. But talk about this and talk about what our listeners might do in order to support this legislation.
Well, this is really important legislation. We're very excited that today it's actually being introduced in the House, and the Senate will be either introduced today or perhaps tomorrow. What's important for your listeners to know that whenever a bill is introduced into Congress, it's essential that it receives adequate co-sponsors from other members of Congress in order for it to actually be acted upon. Because we have all kinds of new opportunities this session of Congress, because Republicans are in control of both the House and the Senate, we want to gain at least 100 co-sponsors in both the House and the Senate together. And right now, we don't have many, obviously, because it's just being introduced today. Listeners can go to our website to learn more, which is theNAEA.org. Or I'll leave information with you too, Kerby. They can also contact their member of Congress and say, we support the Healthy Relationships Act. Would you co-sponsor this? You can even just call it Senator Graham's office if you call your senator, or you can say, would you co-sponsor the Healthy Relationships Act that is sponsored by Representative Hultgren in the House? And that's enough that they then know who to contact, Randy Hultgren's office. And if they have further questions, Mr. Hultgren's office can answer any of those questions, as can Senator Graham's. This is going to implement a change in sex ed policy at the national level that will trickle down to communities throughout the country.
Now, part of the problem is, again, people sometimes hear the word abstinence education. So this one's called Healthy Relationships Act. So they need to know kind of how to communicate that. By the way, we do have a link to the National Abstinence Education Association on the website. Click on your picture or whatever, and that will give you all the information you need to know to contact them. But what you're looking for right now are sponsors both in the House, and we need a few in the Senate right now, don't we?
We do. And, there are some new senators who are just starting their career in the Senate that don't necessarily have an issue that they have attached themselves to in a big way. It would be great if some of those new senators would become champions in the Senate for sexual risk avoidance education. There are also some senators in some of your listeners' states who are very supportive of this initiative, but have never co-sponsored anything like this. It's time for them to hear from their constituents and say, I've noticed you're not on the bill. We'd like to see you on. This is really going to help our young people and the constituents in your state have better outcomes as a result.
Now, one of the things is that it would really kind of change some of the priority right now, because in sex education, what we do is we spend a lot of money teaching kids to have sex and very little money telling them that maybe waiting till marriage to have sex is a better idea. And so it would change the priorities, would it not?
It would. I was having a conversation with someone not long ago, and I said, what if there was this magic formula that could reduce incarceration rates for young people who then translate to incarcerated as adults? What if we could reduce the fatherlessness rate? What if we could reduce the poverty rate, which we've also already talked about? What if we could increase the graduation rate in schools and help young people transition from adolescence to adulthood to become productive members of society? What if we could reduce dating violence? And the list goes on and on and on. I said, wouldn't that be phenomenal? Well, what is that magic formula? It's really giving young people the inspiration, the information, and the skills to delay sex, understand how to make healthy decisions, set goals for their lives, and then these good decisions become habits for life, and all of a sudden you have a life that doesn't look at all like what it did a short time before.
So anybody listening to this says, okay, what's it going to cost? And from what I understand, it adds no new money to the budget.
None at all. All it does is take some of the money that the president is currently giving to sexual normalization education and devoting it to sexual risk avoidance instead.
So again, it is called the Healthy Relationships Act. You can find out more about that because we do have a link to the National Abstinence Education Association. And we do really encourage you to contact your members of Congress and find out if they have sponsored it. The chances are very good they have not. So then the next step is to say, why wouldn't you sponsor something that is going to change the priorities in the way in which we teach sex? It is going to close some of these loopholes. It's going to offer choice to communities. It's not going to cost any more. And it's going to avoid many of those risk behaviors that we all later on have to pay such a heavy price for. So you can't find a better win-win than that one, I don't think.
Yeah, and if I can just encourage your listeners that their call is really, really important. Members of Congress really don't get all that many calls. And when they do, they really listen because every call they say, if one person calls, that stands for thousands of constituents who don't call. When I've met with different members, I've asked them to co-sponsor legislation in the past, and they said, I'm very supportive, but I need to hear from my constituents back home.
Sure. So I think it's time for you to get involved. We'll try to see if we can put up an action alert, but there are all the marching orders you need right at the moment. Again, Healthy Relationships Act, and it is something that is already sponsored by a number of individuals. Let me mention them again. Representative Randy Hultgren, for our listeners from Illinois, he's a Republican. Dan Lipinski is a Democrat from Illinois, so we've got Illinois well represented, although there are a few other representatives we can certainly get from that state. In the Senate, we know that Lindsey Graham from South Carolina has supported it, and we need some more. So certainly we'll take some action items. Let's, if we can, maybe take a phone call or two. If you'd like to join the conversation today, that number is 1-800-351-1212. And since we mentioned South Carolina, let's start there first. Douglas in South Carolina, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, how are you doing today? My question was the program of abstinence. How does that deal with the homosexual trend, trying to deter our children from becoming homosexual?
Well, it's kind of a broader question, but if you're telling young people not to get involved sexually, whether it's somebody of the opposite sex or somebody of the same sex, and to make those decisions later on, I think that's a good thing because there's a fair amount of, as we've talked about on this program before, gender confusion and sexual confusion. We get so many mixed messages. I just don't think that a 13-year-old, 14-year-old, 15-year-old, 16-year-old is in any position to make wise choices. And yet, nevertheless, we tell them to make decisions that could affect them for the rest of their lives, right?
You know, we think that our programs are important to any student in the class, and it doesn't matter if they identify as homosexual or heterosexual. Just like Kerby said, they need the skills and the information to wait to have sex. And they need to understand, regardless of who that student is, what a healthy relationship looks like, what true friendship looks like, how do I focus on the future. There doesn't need to be any kind of division in our students as these healthy behaviors are discussed and skills concomitant with that. And we would argue that to make a separation really is setting an artificial barrier where we're telling one group of students, you don't deserve the same health outcomes that the rest of the students in this class deserve, and we don't believe that to be the case.
You know, I talked about teenagers too. They're not in the best position sometimes to make good decisions. We know a little bit more about brains, and we know that prefrontal cortex doesn't develop right away. That's one of the reasons why we do not rent cars to young men that are under the age of 21. I mean, there are very good reasons why we recognize that sometimes they're not making good decisions. And when you add sex to this, I remember seeing some studies a while back that suggested that indeed condoms are effective, but I noticed the small print said when used consistently and correctly. Do the words consistently and correctly fit with the teenagers? I remember it was hard for me when I had teenage kids in the home to get them to consistently and correctly brush their teeth, consistently and correctly bring their lunch to school every day. And when we impose that and say, oh, yeah, you can be involved sexually and you're going to be safe from some of that, I think there are some really significant issues that I want to talk about after our break. We'll be back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Valerie Huber with us for just a few more minutes, and we're talking about the National Abstinence Education Association's attempt to get you to encourage your elected representatives to be one of the co-sponsors of the Healthy Relationships Act. And just before we went to the break, though, I was talking about the fact that young people tend to be involved in risky behavior, and they tend to think that they're bulletproof and they'll never be affected by it. There's a problem there, isn't it?
Well, it is. And you know, a lot of times young people say, well, I know that those are consequences that can happen, but they're going to happen to somebody else because I'm going to be careful.
Yeah. And which never happens, as you are well aware of. And, you know, this idea that they don't even talk about safe sex anymore. They talk about safer sex because they recognize that they really can't promote that. But let's, for just a few minutes, again, talk about what people can do by getting associated with you. I know, for example, that we have many people that work in pregnancy resource centers and others that are concerned about the kind of education that's taking place in the public schools. So when they go to your website, let's talk about ways in which they can connect up with you.
Well, that'd be great. There are a couple of ways that particularly pregnancy resource centers or concerned parents can be involved. One is to receive our updates. We send out weekly updates, and if there's something going on in your state, we make sure that our readers are the first to know. We also have an event coming up in Washington, D.C. That we encourage your listeners to consider being a part of, and that is Abstinence Day on the Hill.
April 3rd, yes.
It's actually March 25th this year.
Oh, I'm looking at from last year. Yes, okay. Well, that was from last year. So
there you go.
March 21st. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just reading it off the screen. Anyway.
Okay, we need to update that one too, don't we?
But okay, let's talk about that because that's a great way for teens to get really involved in Abstinence Day there on the Hill. So what a great opportunity.
It really is. And what we find are that members of Congress want to meet with young people. They want to hear their opinions on things. And so this is a great opportunity for a teen to make a difference throughout the country. We're also going to be asking the White House to meet with some of our teens who come this year. And so who knows but what some parent who's listening right now could have their teen have an opportunity to have a once-in-a-lifetime conversation either on the Hill or even in the White House.
You have lots of opportunities for people to contact their member of Congress about this Healthy Relationships Act. I also know that you do something like a sexual risk avoidance certification. So if somebody says, well, I need to know more about this because this would be something helpful in our ministry or our outreach to the community, there are some ways in which people can connect up with you in that regard too, isn't there?
Yes, this is actually a credential that's much akin to a graduate class at the college level. But what it does is it equips those who want to teach in the school sexual risk avoidance education, who want to know a little bit more about what the research shows, how to be able to respond to maybe attacks that those who don't support abstinence education, how to use the media to your advantage, how to implement best practices, all of those sorts of things that are kind of foundational understanding to this whole field, and then to be able to effectively connect with young people in the community, even in the local church, in the public school. And we actually have several SRAS trainings already on the books for 2015, and registration is open right now.
Let me also suggest you go to their website because they have a lot of information that you could cut and paste, or you could just have a link to it on your Facebook page, things like Abstinence Works and the report from the CDC about risk report and those kinds of things. So again, we know that you're activists. We really want to give you as much information as possible to make a difference. But one last time, I know you're going to be updating this on your website, but we want to start creating a list, if we can, of those people that have been sponsoring or plan to sponsor the Healthy Relationships Act. And again, as they call their member of Congress, give us a little bit of a talking point on what we need to say in order to see if that particular elected representative would want to sponsor that legislation.
Right. They just need to call their Washington, D.C. office and say, I'm constituent so-and-so from this member of Congress's district. We'd like to know if you have co-sponsored Senator Graham's in the Senate or Senator Hultgren and Lipinski's Healthy Relationships Act yet. And if they say, I'm not sure what that is, they can call Representative Hultgren or Lipinski or Graham's office, find out about that, but say, I'm counting on you to support our young people in our district by co-sponsoring this legislation right away.
Now, there's also an attempt to reauthorize, of course, the abstinence education program as it exists, so that's certainly something, and appropriations. This is where the big battle takes place right now, and as you said just a minute ago, we really need to have, if you will, some talking points, because the sad reality is that words like abstinence have been vilified and criticized and marginalized, and yet if we really want to do the things that are best for young people in the future, that is the case. And there is a very significant difference in priority where we spend a lot of money telling kids on how to be sexually active safely, in quotes, and we spend very little on telling them maybe the safest sex is no sex at all before marriage. And so those priorities need to be changed. And here, I think you have a new opportunity with a new session of Congress, don't you?
Absolutely. And any of your listeners who decide to sign up to receive our weekly updates, we send out talking points. If there's something new that hits the news cycle, having to do with teen sex or sex education in a locale, we love to equip parents to be able to protect their children and to be able to converse in a way that makes sense to those who are supportive, but also brings those who are on the fence over to our side.
Well, again, I appreciate you taking the time to be in the studio today, and I look forward to getting some more information from you so that we can educate our listeners about how they can take action, because we've got a lot of activists out there, and I think many of them have probably heard enough to know, yeah, we need to change some of the priorities here, and this is a great opportunity to do so. It wasn't front and center in the State of the Union address last night, although it should have been, because if you really want to deal with poverty and you want to deal with risk behaviors, this is certainly the case. So as people find out a little bit more, let's see if we can get some teenagers out there and go to that opportunity to just go all the way and begin to inundate all of the members of Congress with some of those messages. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you so much.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, spend some time talking about the State of the Union address. But first, I have Christopher Brooks with us. We're going to talk about his new book, and as we have already mentioned, we've given you a couple of action items. My commentary today on the issue of Obamacare is available to you, so feel free to read that and listen to it and pass it on. Our uncensored video at the moment on human trafficking, another very important issue. And of course, we've already encouraged you to take the time to scroll down to Valerie Huber's website, which is abstinenceassociation.org or the NAEA. Either way, you can find it both places, and we have the links there. We have information for you to begin to track the co-sponsors of this abstinence bill, which is called Healthy Relationships Act. And of course, we also have an opportunity for you to maybe consider what you might do to get involved in some of those activities, and especially want to challenge some of you young people. Abstinence Day on the Hill. What a great opportunity. So we'll be talking about that in the future, and want you to take the time to visit the website pointofview.net. As we take a break, let's also encourage you to take the time to watch some of the videos that we have made available, and we have a button there that says Make an Impact, Make a Difference. And that is based on some of the videos we've just been sending out about those people that have listened to Point of View in the past, have made a decision to be the salt of the earth, the light of the world, and we really encourage you to support this ministry so that we can continue educating, empowering, and encouraging others to be a difference maker in their community. It's all available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be back with more right after this.
When you're listening to or watching network news, do you ever start talking to the newsreader or anchor person? Come on, you can admit it, you do, don't you? You can't believe what you're hearing, and you feel the need to correct them. Sometimes you almost feel like you're living in a different world, and you are. People who deny God are living in a world of make-believe. The next time you're shaking your head at the news, I want you to do something. Pick up the phone or write a check or visit us online and give. Point of View brings you a biblically informed analysis of what's happening, but to do it, we need your partnership. Visit pointofview.net and click the link next to Donate Now where it says Become a Monthly Partner. Pointofview.net. Or mail your donation for this month to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. That's Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Don't just shake your head. Make a difference.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
So often here on Point of View, we talk about how to enable you to articulate a biblical worldview and also to know how to defend a biblical worldview. That second point is what is oftentimes called apologetics, how we defend the Christian faith. And yet, when we talk about this, sometimes it is in a setting that needs some kind of contextualization. If you think about it, much of the New Testament was written in an urban setting where the Christian community had to address many of the issues we address today in the urban environment. That's why I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about this new book, Urban Apologetics, Why the Gospel is Good News for the City. It is written by Christopher Brooks. He is senior pastor of Evangel Ministries, which is a 1,600-member church in the heart of downtown Detroit. He's also a very popular radio talk show host, has been appointed the campus dean of Moody Theological Seminary's Michigan's campus, and has degrees from places like Biola University, and also is the founder of Detroit Bible Institute. In addition to his degree from Biola University, also a graduate of the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics at Oxford University, and an individual that speaks occasionally with Ravi Zacharias. So, Chris, it is great to have you on the program with us today.
Hey, Kerby, it's great to be with you and with the Point of View family.
One of the things that we have also done, in addition to posting information about your book, is a very good article that was written about you, an interview that appeared in Christianity Today. So it kind of gets us into the whole conversation about this. And you graduated from Biola, and I know in the book you talk about the fact that you said, I need to sort of take some of the things that I learned in apologetics and apply them to Detroit, Michigan. And that contextualization is very important, isn't it?
It is. It's a tremendously important aspect of the work that we do. You know, my good friend Ravi Zacharias often says to answer the wrong question rightly is no different than answering the wrong question at all. Mm-hmm. So I think for most of us, we have to make sure that we are answering the questions that people are asking. So it was important to me to find out what are the unique questions that are being wrestled with and discussed in the inner city context in particular, and in the urban context more broadly, and how do we bring apologetics and theology and a biblical worldview to bear on these critical issues.
One of the things you talk about early on in the book is the need for definitions, you know, whether it's kingdom of the cults or whatever. You recognize that some people may be using the same words, but they mean different things. And in a minority community, in an urban community, very important issues, aren't they?
They are, and I would add to that thought that we need not only definition of words, but we need definition of concepts. You know, this is very true, especially in economics. We hear a lot of conversation about economic equality and justice, and a lot of these ideas pull at the heartstrings, but when you unpack the actual policies that will be a part of them, you realize that, man, we're really striving for the same thing, but we have totally different worldviews, and ideas do have consequences. So, yeah, we do need definition on the terms. What do you mean when you say that? And we also need definitions on ideas.
How does apologetics and justice come together? Because oftentimes I see apologetics done in a sort of a sterile environment, and yet you have to obviously address those issues of justice and apologetics in the same context, don't you?
So let's start with defining. So apologetics to me, and I think a lot of those in the apologetic world would agree with this definition, it is at its base level answering the questions that people have about the gospel, in particular the objections that people have about the gospel. So if we start there with a kind of a broad definition of apologetics, then we begin to say what are the unique objections that various people groups have towards the gospel. And in a ethnic minority community, oftentimes the justice issues are the greatest challenge. What I found in researching the book is that most of the white evangelical churches that I interacted with had a real heart for righteousness issues such as human sexuality and the sanctity of life and religious liberties. These are very important issues. Whereas within minority communities, there was often this cry for justice issues.
Right.
Educational justice, economic justice. And the wonderful thing about the gospel is that Scripture tells us that the foundation of the Lord is established upon both righteousness and justice. So my question in the book is, how do we bring these two issues together without compromising the gospel? And I think it's possible.
Well, I think you've certainly done a very good job of that in trying to help us understand that really when you take the gospel around the world, and we can broaden it beyond just Detroit, Michigan, or the United States, and that is recognize that there are different ways in which people hear the gospel, different roadblocks, different kind of issues. And I think a person that is really going to be adept at evangelism is going to really have to be a person with some great discernment. And so for just a minute, let's talk about evangelism, because you talk about the 3 B's of conversational evangelism, and I found those to be very helpful. The boulevard strategy, the belief strategy, and the barrier strategy. There's a lot of great takeaways in your book, but that one shows up very early in the book, and I would like to pass that on to our listeners.
So, when we're talking to people about Christ, the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, what is the on-ramp? What's the boulevard? And that's the first B, is to say, hey, are there particular issues that I can use to draw a person into a conversation about the gospel? If you look at all the statistics about our culture right now, most will say that there's a growing resentment towards organized religion in general, that people are becoming more anti-Christian. But yet, those same polls will tell you that people are very passionate about issues of immigration and economics and energy policy and those types of issues. But what if we use those as on-ramps for the gospel and help people to see what Scripture has to say about these things? So I think with every individual, we want to look at how do we pull the gospel into their world. Secondly, the barriers. We can't assume that people have not already heard about Christ. So we need to ask ourselves and ask them, what has kept you from accepting Christ as your Savior? Assuming that they have heard about the Christian message, what prevents you from giving your life to Christ? It's really a revealing question, and I think that's really really important. And then the beliefs, making sure we don't assume that just because someone labels themselves by a particular world religion, that means that they adhere to those tenets perfectly. Each person is kind of a composite of kind of various ideas. So we want to know uniquely, what does this person believe? Because oftentimes, I'm sure you found this to be true too, Kerby, that people are kind of a hodgepodge of things, and we need to know who we're dealing with and not just overall generalization.
And again, a lot of people sort of have a cafeteria philosophy. They take from here and take from there. They saw that in Newsweek magazine. They heard Oprah say that, and then they saw something, and Beyonce said something else, and pretty soon you've got this really mixed up worldview. So I need to take a break. When we come back, though, I'd love to talk about that issue, because in some respects, people have a misunderstanding of the gospel, and you talk about such things, for example, as liberation theology or the Nation of Islam and others, and so that's all the more reason why we need to define our terms. But let me just commend to all of you, this is a book published by Kriegel. We have information about it on our website, 170 pages, as well as we have a very good article that appeared in Christianity Today, and I think for those of us that certainly do understand the importance of knowing how to defend their faith, we certainly also need to understand this in the cultural context of the urban environment, and I think Chris Brooks has done an outstanding job writing this book. We'll talk more with him right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
You know, when the Affordable Care Act was debated years ago, one of the most compelling arguments for its passage was a claim that it would make health insurance affordable for people with lower incomes. Now that the employer mandate kicks in 2015, we're finding that it is the people with modest incomes who are being hurt the most. Dr. John Goodman has for decades provided expert testimony before Congress on health care issues and health insurance. His survey last month of 136 fast food restaurants with nearly 3,500 workers tells the story. The regulations in Obamacare forced the employers to make tough financial decisions that had an adverse impact on their employees and families. Let's take a before and after picture. Before 2014, about half of these 3,500 workers were full-time, according to the Obamacare definition. In other words, they worked 30 or more hours a week. By the end of 2014, only 58 employees were full-time and thus eligible for health insurance by 2015. The companies then offered the remaining full-time employees health insurance. What they offered was a bronze plan with very large deductibles, over $6,000, and copays. Hardly anyone wanted a high deductible plan. Actually, that's an understatement. Only one of the 58 remaining full-time employees enrolled in a bronze plan. The rest may end up with a minimum essential coverage plan. You know, this survey bothers me for two reasons. First, John Goodman and many others predicted that this would happen years ago. Congress did not listen. Second, it is appalling that it had to be done by a private citizen. Where are the news bureaus and government agencies? Why haven't they done a similar study on the impact of Obamacare? We've not been well served either by politicians, bureaucrats, or the media. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
New book out by Christopher Brooks, and it is published by Kriegel, called Urban Apologetics, Why the Gospel is Good News for the City. And Chris, I thought we might for just a minute talk about some of the false messages that people find and hear in the urban environment. I mentioned a few, but we can broaden it beyond just the Nation of Islam or prosperity gospel and others. It does seem to me that right now those theological voices and barriers are, again, making it difficult for some people to really see the true gospel.
Yeah, you can categorize these maybe in three different broad categories. One is liberation theologies, or what has been known in the black community as black nationalist theology, which really is an offshoot of the civil rights era and rooted in, unfortunately, racial hatred and a sense of disenfranchisement. And then you can get into those prosperity theories and theologies, which unfortunately, again, are rooted in man being the center of the gospel and material wealth being the goal of the gospel. And then you have right there with those kind of liberal theologies, where it's all about social justice and societal change, but not about personal righteousness and repentance. And so all of these do come up. And if you're going to do evangelism and apologetics in your urban context, you better be prepared to address these issues.
Another aspect of that is the moral issue. In one of your chapters, you talk about kind of the urban ethical foundations. And so you have relativism, you have postmodernism. These are not unique, obviously, to just the urban environment, but all those ideas that we talk about sometimes on this program certainly surface in the urban environment as well, don't they?
They do. And I think that we have to not assume that they don't. And then what I find often is that we kind of let our philosophical guard down, if you will, when we're doing ministry in minority communities, maybe assuming that they're not wrestling with these things, but they're just as real, just as prevalent. And when we get into morality, what I found is that typically within the history, the social history of most ethnic minority groups in America is a conservative morality, and that works to our advantage as Christians. As we try to bring that up, I think it's just as important to say, hey, look at the history of your people and how they've historically stood on issues of morality, and look at the way things are right now. Let's discuss that difference.
Oh, very good. You know, one of your chapters is on Christ and the family, and also in your article that we've mentioned in Christianity Today, you talk about one of the other challenges, and that is the decline of the family. And we talked about this on Monday, on Martin Luther King Day, a little bit, but I want to come back to that because that is a very significant challenge, a lack of intact families, a lack of a father present. We've, of course, on this program sometimes talked about if you don't have a good relationship with your earthly father, sometimes you don't understand the idea of a heavenly father. So these are some real challenges you face right there in the urban community, isn't it?
It is. And let me just bring balance to this discussion. It's not debatable that there is a problem. We all would universally agree on that. There's a ubiquitous issue that is touching the urban family that maybe is not unlike those in other non-minority communities, and that is fatherlessness, which probably you could tie 2,000 or more social issues right to the doorstep of fatherlessness. But I think that we have to make sure we don't fall into the pitfall of social analysis that only looks at the effect without questioning the causes.
Yes.
And so I just encourage people to be sensitive to the causes, to recognize that within minority communities there still is a great desire for strong families, but there are a number of issues that undermine that, not the least of which is misguided public policy that often is well-intentioned but ends up hurting the family. We need to make sure we're aware.
You know, and you do quote from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who I have quoted many times because he was pointing to that potential problem in the 1960s. And of course, it's not just in an urban environment now. I mean, you can go across the board and you can pick any particular ethnic group and recognize that the levels of unwed pregnancy are going up every single year in every ethnic identifiable group. And so this is not just an urban issue, it's a suburban issue, it's a worldwide problem, and it's a problem in America, and it's something to address. And I appreciate the fact that you brought that up, because it seems to me that sometimes we talk about issues of sexuality, issues like abortion, which will be the conversation tomorrow during the anniversary of Roe versus Wade, without tying it into family issues and policy issues. So you've done, I think, a very good job of reminding us that we have to look not just at the effects, but the causes too.
We do, and I hope that what that will do is cause us to have more of a graceful and dare I say sympathetic view of individuals that have participated in the destruction of the family on a grassroots level, or maybe even had an abortion. You know, I'm a pastor as well, and we have a Sanctity of Life month that we will begin on February 1st. And it's amazing to me, year after year, I run into women who were taught that abortion was a form of birth control. It was just an erroneous thing that they were taught. And so we try to approach the pro-life issue as much from an ethical perspective as we do from an emotional healing perspective. We find that when we speak in terms of healing and grace as well as righteousness, that we see hearts transformed.
You also have a chapter on social justice, and that has been a problem in the past, as you well know, because sometimes the evangelical, the fundamentalists have said, well, justice issues, we're not going to get into those, you know. And, of course, the liberals say, well, get into the social issues, but we don't necessarily agree with their theology. We don't have to accept that kind of schism or divided idea, do we?
No, we don't. And a good friend of mine, John Dixon, who's a historian, Christian historian, says it this way, that the church, from the New Testament perspective, has one mission, and that is the gospel and the advancement and the proclamation of the gospel. But we also have one major ethic, and that's love. And we do have a duty to ask ourselves, what does love look like, not only in personal, private relationships, but on a public perspective, what does true love look like? And hopefully we can love in the individual context of relationships, but we can also love socially as well.
Let's, if we can, just before I let you go, talk about what you can do in the local church. I know that we have a number of pastors that listen to this, and we have a link to your ministry that people can go to. But in Chapter 9, you talk about the role of urban apologetics in the local church. What does that look like? Because it seems to me that we have a lot of listeners that could benefit not only by reading the book, but also by making contact with you at your website.
I'm so glad you brought that up. Let me just emphasize, every church needs an apologist, and every apologist needs a church. Apologists need to be pastored, discipled, shepherded, and this is one of the biggest roles a local church can play, accountability and keeping a person deeply rooted in Scripture. Unfortunately, as you know, apologetics can get kind of off into philosophy, into public life issues, and get away from Scripture. So we need to be rooted in Scripture. But also every local church needs someone who's trained on how to give answers to the objections that people are asking for the gospel. So the apologist becomes the pastor's best friend. So I pray that through the book I show pastors how to relate to the apologists that are in their churches and apologists on how to get an audience in a relationship with the pastor where the pastor doesn't feel threatened by their ministry.
Very good. The website, Evangel Ministries, evangelministries.org, there's a place where people can contact you. There are places where they can actually see some of the sermons and listen to some of the sermons and things of that nature. Yeah. And I know that you would encourage the listeners right now, or especially people in leadership, this could be pastors, elders, Bible study teachers, and others, that they can contact you and find out a little bit more about what you've been doing in the city of Detroit and how you've been really motivating and educating others to take apologetics into the urban environment. So as they go to the website, what can they find when they land there?
Well, they're going to find, as you said, teaching and some of the projects that I'm currently working on. But if they want to contact me personally, always feel free. You can join me on social media at Pastor Chris Brooks. Traditional spelling, C-H-R-I-S, Pastor Chris Brooks. I'd love to connect with you there and become friends on Facebook. Or you can email me at chris.brooks@moody.edu. That's chris.brooks@moody.edu.
Well, it's just an outstanding book. We'll probably cover it again, but I did want to give people a chance to know that there is hope for the urban community, that you have written such an outstanding book. It came out last year, and I wanted everybody to know about it. And let's see if we can do an interview with you again sometime in the future.
Hey, Kerby, it's been great being with you and the Point of View family, and God bless you and the work that you're doing.
Chris Brooks with us, and again, the book is entitled Urban Apologetics, Why the Gospel is Good News for the City. It is published by Kriegel's. You can look for it in your local bookstore, but we have a link so that you could order it. I would really encourage you to contact him. What is going on in his community and what he has been doing is really groundbreaking, and so we wanted to give you a little bit of a chance to hear about that today, but I did want to leave a little bit of time at the end here just to talk about the State of the Union address yesterday. We will play a few of the clips. You'll have a chance to hear a little bit of what President Obama had to say, and I'll give a few comments about that in this last half hour. And of course, if you'd like to join the conversation at any point, 1-800-351-1212. We did our best to cover a couple of other issues today, knowing full well that sometimes we can spend a lot of time talking about the State of the Union address, but we'll give it its due now in this last half hour, so stay tuned. We'll talk about the State of the Union address and hear what President Obama had to say right after this.
Did you catch Eric Holder on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos? He said the president is planning a summit to study those who, quote, corrupt the Islamic faith to justify terrorism. But since it was Muhammad himself leading the slaughter of men, women, and children for not bowing to Allah back in the 7th century, I wonder if they might discover who corrupted it back then. You know, it takes real effort to ignore the obvious, but it would seem our officials and many in the media make that effort. They can't see that those who take part in terrorist acts are following a straightforward interpretation of Muhammad's teachings and actions and all of the Quran. In a world of political correctness, Point of View Radio stands out. We seek the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and bring it to you daily. But we cannot be here without your support. Give online at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Did want to spend just a few minutes talking about the State of the Union address, and that is something that is an annual event. It is required by the Constitution that from time to time the President actually give a report to Congress, information on the State of the Union, Article 2, Section 3. Now, historically, it was a fairly short speech. George Washington's speech in 1790 was only a few minutes long in New York City, but he did deliver it before Congress. John Adams did the same, but as I've pointed out before, Thomas Jefferson decided that that was maybe a little too regal, a little too much like the Parliament and the King. So he simply sent a report in writing in 1801, and that continued on until 1913, when Woodrow Wilson revived the idea of actually delivering that message before Congress. And that has continued ever since. And as I mentioned before, it was still in the daytime hours. They might rethink this. Very few people want to watch this in prime time, and there were a lot of complaints about it. But nevertheless, the president did what every president has done in modern times, and that is to give this speech in front of joint session of Congress on primetime television. And he began by talking about the fact that we are turning a page. Obviously, he wanted to talk about what he refers to, and I think we're going to hear him refer to for some time as middle-class economics, saying that it worked and had a very significant impact. And so he really kind of set forth this idea of middle-class economics. Whether the term really catches on, I don't know, but it's an attempt to at least look different than so-called trickle-down economics or Reaganomics or Obamonomics. So we'll see where that goes. But we wanted to focus on just a couple of issues that the president has been speaking on, and one of those has to do with a community college situation. He pointed out in the speech that 40% of college students choose community college. Some are young and starting out, some are older and looking for a better job, some are veterans and single parents trying to transition back to the job market. But his argument is that what we are going to try to do in Congress is to actually reduce the cost of higher education down to the number 0.
By the end of this decade, 2 in 3 job openings will require some higher education. 2 in 3. And yet we still live in a country where too many bright, striving Americans are priced out of the education they need. It's not fair to them, and it's sure not smart for our future. And that's why I'm sending this Congress a bold new plan to lower the cost of community college to 0.
Argument he made to reduce it to 0, but he also said that there are places where free community college is already taking place.
Tennessee, a state with Republican leadership, and Chicago, a city with Democratic leadership, are showing that free community college is possible. And I want to spread that idea all across America so that 2 years of college becomes as free and universal in America as high school is today.
So again, he's using 2 examples, one of what is happening in Tennessee and one is happening in Chicago. Let's be honest for just a minute, and that is you talk about various things that a president puts on the table which are non-starters, whether it was Ronald Reagan speaking before a Democratic-controlled Senate, and always, of course, having a Democratic-controlled House, whether it was Bill Clinton speaking before a Republican-controlled House, or, of course, George W. Bush in his later years speaking to a democratically controlled House. You know that some of these ideas are non-starters. This would have been a non-starter even if you had Democrats control both the House and the Senate. You can't have a country that is $18 trillion in debt to then say, let's spend more money on college. And if indeed you are going to fund this with, as we're going to talk about in just a few minutes, this idea of trying to increase taxes, number one, you're not going to get a tax increase. And number two, as we pointed out, this has happened at a very significant time when, as I pointed out yesterday, if you look at the American Legislative Exchange Council, they estimate that 14 different states last year enacted significant tax reform. They're now estimating that probably 24 states, anywhere from 20 to 25 states, will also make substantial reductions in taxes this year. So at a time when you have almost half of the country in their state legislatures reducing taxes, it just is almost is almost turning a deaf ear, if you will, to the needs and the desires of the American people to talk about raising taxes. But nevertheless, he also said that he wanted to not only have government do some of this, he also wanted to do what he could to encourage the private sector, various companies, to offer more educational opportunities for their employees so they can better themselves.
Tonight, I'm also asking more businesses to follow the lead of companies like CVS and UPS and offer more educational benefits and paid apprenticeships. Opportunities that give workers the chance to earn higher paying jobs, even if they don't have a higher education.
So again, this is the idea that maybe we can encourage the private sector to do that. And if they do, that's all the better. And he used the examples of CVS and UPS. It's interesting he didn't use Starbucks, because that's one that a lot of people have been talking about, providing a way in which people can go back to college and do all of those kinds of things. But again, if that's the encouragement that the president can give, all the better, because certainly we do need to provide an educated citizenry. And the sad reality is, even as we were talking with Valerie Huber in the first hour, if you do not graduate from high school and you have a child before you get married, your chances of going into poverty are much greater. And if you only have a high school degree and have no other technical training, whether it's at a community college for 2 years, whether it's an apprenticeship, or whether it's a 4-year degree or a graduate level degree, you're not going to be able to compete in a society which is turning more and more into an information and industrial society. So those are important issues. I'm just not able to see how we can take money that we don't have and spend it on programs that are still somewhat questionable, so that we can give a degree to an individual so that hopefully they will find a job. But nevertheless, that was one very significant part of the program, and that is he wants to spend more money on things like infrastructure, wants to spend more money on education, and he also made a case that 21st century business needs 21st century infrastructure. Still not so convinced how you can actually improve all of that unless you begin to reassess your priorities. But he spent a fair amount of time talking about we need modern ports, we need stronger bridges, we need faster trains, we need faster internet. And he says we can agree on this, and let's set our sights higher than on a single oil pipeline, which got a laugh because, of course, that is the Keystone XL pipeline. Again, I do not understand why he doesn't go ahead with that. Just take it off the table, Mr. President. But that brings us to the other part of this. All of this is going to cost money. Where's the money going to come from? And so, again, the argument that he made is one that I think both Republicans and Democrats can agree, and that is the current tax code is too one-sided.
As Americans, we don't mind paying our fair share of taxes as long as everybody else does too. But for far too long, lobbyists have rigged the tax code with loopholes that let some corporations pay nothing while others pay full freight. They've riddled it with giveaways that the super rich don't need, while denying a break to middle-class families who do.
So he goes on and then says we have an opportunity to change that. Let's close loopholes so we can stop rewarding companies that keep profits abroad and reward those that invest in America. Let's use those savings to rebuild our infrastructure and make it more attractive for companies to bring jobs at home. Well, if the president is really serious about bringing jobs home, there are a couple of things that can happen simultaneously, and one of those is to reduce the corporate income tax, because that is a penalty, if you will, right now for companies. It's also the reason why we have lots of companies that have now, the best estimates are trillions of dollars overseas. If just he and the Republican House and Senate were to say, we might even just give you a one-time exemption to bring that money back, to repatriate that money back, it would almost be like having one of those stimulus programs without having to spend any money, because they would bring it back and they would invest it in their companies. They would invest it in America, no doubt. They would spend some of it too, certainly, but all of that would help. And so the argument that he is making is best made by simply reducing the tremendous burden that the corporate income tax has on companies right now. But nevertheless, he still argues that closing these tax loopholes would make those who make more pay more.
And let's close the loopholes that lead to inequality by allowing the top 1% to avoid paying taxes on their accumulated wealth. We can use that money to help more families pay for child care and send their kids to college. We need a tax code that truly helps working Americans trying to get a leg up in the new economy, and we can achieve that together.
One of the things some people dug up are the fact that if indeed you are convinced that we need more taxes, you are flying again in the face of some of the facts and figures that are out there right now. Because after all, we brought in $739 billion in our tax revenue. We'll take a break. I'll talk more about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Again, the president gave his State of the Union address last night, and certainly one of the arguments he made and will continue to make is that we need to actually increase the tax rate on a number of individuals. And I thought I'd at least give you some numbers to look at. You can come to your own conclusion, but one of the things I mentioned just as we're coming to the break is right now, the federal government took in a record amount in tax revenue. That record was $739 billion. I might even encourage you to get something to write with for just a minute, because I think it will help you understand why, even when we bring in more money, it doesn't seem to make any difference. Put down the number 739 and then put a B next to it. $739 billion. We have a record in the amount of money that has come in the first quarter of fiscal year 2015. And the fiscal year, interestingly enough, in government runs from September to September. So it's a little different than the fiscal year that most of us are used to. Either we have an annual one, starts from January to December, or else it goes from July to June. But this one really goes from the middle of September to the other middle of September. So anyway, if you look at the first quarter, we've brought in a record $739 billion. So put down 739 with a B. Even so, in the first quarter, we ran a deficit of $176 billion. Put down 176. It doesn't make any difference, seemingly, how much money we bring in. We still continue running deficits. And the argument that some people have made before is they might even go along with increasing the tax rates on different individuals, different entities, and all the rest if we felt that it would go to the right places. But as we have talked about, even with the gas tax, which, by the way, we're going to hear about this because now gas doesn't cost as much, so the tax revenues from gas aren't going to be as much. But the money doesn't always even go to the infrastructures. When the president is talking about let's build these roads and let's build these bridges, well, that's what the taxes on our gasoline was supposed to go to, but that gets moved somewhere else. And so you run into this problem of wanting to have the government have enough money to fulfill government functions, but then the money gets pushed over in different places where it wasn't supposed to be in the first place. And that's certainly one of the great concerns. The president talked about job growth. That is very definitely the case. But at the same time, when we've seen a growth in jobs, we had a record number of Americans not in the workforce, including a record number of women that are not in the labor force. You also had 46 million Americans who are on food stamps. So I've said before that I don't think presidents should take too much credit for what happens economically, nor should they receive too much blame for what happens economically, because after all, the free market runs in large part without government interference, and when it does, government can make things worse, but sometimes it can't necessarily make things better. So on the one hand, if the president wants to take credit for the gas prices going down, which I don't think have anything to do with him, then he also has to take credit and blame for the fact that the price of ground beef is at a record high, that more people are on food stamps than ever before. I mean, it cuts both ways, but it seems to me that those are some very important issues that need to be put on the table. And frankly, I didn't sense that the Republican response even surfaced some of those questions or some of those facts and figures, but I thought I would bring those up here. One other point real quickly, President Obama did say that his plans will make America and hardworking people stronger and more competitive.
Helping hardworking families make ends meet. Giving them the tools they need for good-paying jobs in this new economy. Maintaining the conditions of growth and competitiveness. This is where America needs to go. I believe it's where the American people want to go.
So again, just an emphasis upon what government can do, but I think in some cases, if government can just step out of the way, reduce the tremendous regulatory burdens upon them right now, and certainly talk about cutting especially a corporate tax rate that is punitive and prevents job growth, those would be, I think, much easier, simpler, and more effective solutions. But just before we go, of course, the president also talked about the threat that we face from radical Islam, but he never put those words together, but he did talk about the threat of terrorism.
We stand united with people around the world who've been targeted by terrorists, from a school in Pakistan to the streets of Paris. We will continue to hunt down terrorists and dismantle their networks and we reserve the right to act unilaterally, as we have done relentlessly since I took office, to take out terrorists who pose a direct threat to us and our allies.
He also spoke to the issue of ISIS, and the president said American military power is working in Iraq and Syria to stop the terrorist organization.
Instead of getting dragged into another ground war in the Middle East, we are leading a broad coalition, including Arab nations, to degrade and ultimately destroy this terrorist group. We're also supporting a moderate opposition in Syria that can help us in this effort, and assisting people everywhere who stand up to the bankrupt ideology of violent extremism. Now, this effort will take time. It will require focus. But we will succeed. And tonight I call on this Congress to show the world that we are united in this mission by passing a resolution to authorize the use of force against ISIL. We need that authority.
So again, just a little bit of an idea of some of the things he had to speak about. Near the end, he talked about also another pillar of our leadership is values, and that's where he talked about the respect for human dignity, why he said he's prohibited torture and actually wanted to make use of new technology like drones and other things, and of course went on to talk about his commitment to justice and even our civil liberties. And so a speech that he gave that lasted for quite some time, and the harsh reality is that he, as well as other presidents, have found sometimes in their second term, they aren't able to get very much of their wish list enacted by Congress, and I suspect that will be the prediction I will make this time as well. But we will see how this plays out in the next couple of days, because right now, Congress is in session. We gave you some action items in the first hour, and we will give you many more, because this is a new Congress, new leadership, and maybe some new opportunities to find some bipartisan efforts. I certainly think that will take place in the issue of trade. We'll see what the president does with the issue of the Keystone XL pipeline, and of course the establishment of a budget, which we have not had passed by both houses of Congress in some time, will also maybe put the nation back on the right keel, because predictability is going to be very important if indeed the small business community and corporations are able to make predictions about the future. And the uncertainty that has certainly surrounded the Congress and the president and the changing in executive orders has made it very difficult for job growth. So we'll see how that plays out. That's all we have for today. Tomorrow, of course, is the anniversary of Roe versus Wade, so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. We'll also spend a little bit of time talking about some other issues that will certainly be of interest to you. And of course, Friday is our weekend edition, so all of the material that we've talked about today will certainly be available to you on our website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to know more about the issue of abstinence and reducing risk behaviors among young people, Valerie Huber was with us in the first hour as we talked about some of the work that she is doing. If you're interested in this idea of urban apologetics, Christopher Brooks was with us, and I might mention that his book, Urban Apologetics, is a great resource for you and is published by Kriegel, and you can find it in our website, and certainly look for it in your local bookstore, but also you can order it from him if you'd like to get a copy. My commentary today on the devastating effect that Obamacare is having on people with lower incomes. I encourage you to read and to take the time to maybe pass on to others. It's a good example of where we need to reevaluate some of the policies that have been implemented over these years. But that's all we have for today. I want to thank Andrew and Catherine and Chris for their help behind the scenes. See you back here tomorrow on the anniversary of Roe versus Wade.
The Point of View radio talk show is broadcast 2 hours each day, but you can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. There you'll also be among the first to see our new videos, Uncensored, a series highlighting issues impacting this generation and the next. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. @Point of View RTS. Learn, interact, Make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Together, let's go viral. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.